Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference of the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese. I am particularly honored to be here with you, at least virtually, and to be able to talk about something that is at the heart of learning, language learning, but it's also very close to my research and my interest, and it's at my heart when I think of language learning. So, our talk will deal with mediation at the heart of language learning towards a plurilingual action-oriented approach. And I will guide you through the following plan so that we will make sense of these different concepts. The first point will be to talk with you, to see with you the importance of transparency and coherence in language learning and the contribution that a very important document has made to that, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. We will then move to the heart of the presentation, which is the concept of mediation as it has been developed with the new CFR, and the way this concept has both been reconceptualized and opening to a new conceptualization of language education in general. Then we will go to see the difference between plurilingualism and multilingualism when we have different languages, two concepts that can be key to help us navigate the complexity we're faced with increasingly every day in our classes and in our society, and what is the role of mediation vis-a-vis plurilingual and multilingual education. And then finally, I would like to link what I have said to the practice and give you some examples of things that are being done and possibilities for future development, and reasoning with you on the implications of teaching that all that can have. So let's start with some background and why we are talking about transparency and coherence in language learning. What does that mean? So, if we consider the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages that I'm sure you are familiar with, it was published about 20 years ago now in its first edition, and it has become a document used throughout the world for different languages. The main point we can say that the main contribution that the CFR has brought to our vision of language is to remind us of the strict link, constant and strict link between learning, teaching, and assessment. We know that traditionally assessment was seen as a kind of extra burden, let's say, and a lot has been done and a lot of discussion about pedagogy and learning languages and what does it mean, and teaching, how we can improve teaching, but somehow this link has not always been at the forefront. So one of the main aspects of the CFR is to bring that back to where it belongs, at the forefront of our reflection on language and language education. As I said, it is about 20 years old, and we can definitely say that it is a milestone because it has already achieved something that is very important, like providing common reference points and thus infusing transparency through the levels, the levels that are very famous now, going from A1 to C2, A1 and 2, B1, B2, C1, C2. Through its descriptive scheme, I will tell more about that. So the articulation of communicative activities and competencies, etc. And I will say more later. And a very rich set of illustrative descriptors, all in positive form, in form of can-do statement, that guide the process of both setting objectives and assessing. What is still ongoing, and it's a very positive aspect, is this idea that the CFR has stimulated reflection on the complexity of language education. What is language education and what is implied, and why is it not a linear thing that I can easily solve going from A to B? And thus, through this ongoing reflection, is also fostering pedagogical innovation, and in particular, the action-oriented approach, which is the approach that the CFR proposes, is becoming clearer to practitioners and researchers alike. So, CFR planning, teaching, assessing. Two main concepts are linked to this idea of the triadic relationship of planning, teaching, and assessment. Constructive alignment, which is the process of ensuring coherence between curriculum, teaching, and assessment. And how do you do that? Usually you do that by planning both the curriculum and assessment in relation to what you want to obtain, what are your desired outcomes. And this process is called backward design, because you basically see where you want to go and then you plan backward. And this backward design, in fact, can be defined as a way of identifying the learner needs first and the necessary outcomes. And usually you do that in terms of real-world competencies, as at least this is what the CFR suggests. Then you're planning the necessary enabling objectives. So how can I enable my students to be able to perform at that level? And you plan the learning activities that go with that and other course content that you may need. But you plan, as I said, backwards. So from those outcomes, you plan backwards. The idea of a transparent, coherent curriculum, which is at the core of the CFR, can be summarized in this way. So planning, you have goal setting, as I said, and you signpost those goal setting with the can-do descriptors of the CFR. Then you teach using an action-oriented approach, which envisions language as an activity. And finally, you assess during tasks. You assess with your descriptors, remembering that you have two kinds of descriptors in the CFR, well, more than two, but the core types are two, those that help you to design your task and those that give you the possibility of defining and making explicit criteria for the quality of the language. So basically, one important point that we have really moved towards is the idea of adopting exclusively a proficiency perspective instead of a deficiency perspective, not saying, oh, we can't do that, they can't do that yet, but saying what they can do, even if it is at a lower level of proficiency, and the idea of a strategic and dynamic view of competence development, because the descriptive scheme and the can-do statements allow to have an overview of all the elements that come into play when we develop language proficiency. So let's see what this descriptive scheme is. Well, this is the graphical, let's say, representation of the descriptive scheme of the CFR. In the CFR 2001, there was not such a representation so clear. This is the one you find in the new CFR, the so-called CFR companion volume, which was published online last year. So, as you can see, we have different communicative language activities of reception, production, interaction, and mediation with the relevant strategies. And we have a distinction between activities, what you can do in the language, and the competencies. What kind of linguistic, sociolinguistic, and pragmatic competencies are involved in your activity, in your language activities? And we are not, when we language, as Mary Swain would say, when we use the language and we learn the language, we're not just focusing on language. We have general competencies. As human beings, we have a certain history, and we have some knowledge of the world, some skills and know-how. We have some existential competence, and we are able to learn. All that is listed by the CFR under general competencies, and I have kept the French version, which is in the CFR, because it somehow better expresses what we are talking about. Savoir-être, par exemple, for instance, is not necessarily easily understandable under the translation existential skills. So, but the main point in this descriptive scheme that we have to bear in mind is that we have had a move from 4 skills, listening, reading, speaking, and writing, to 4 modes of communication, of which, of course, reception and production correspond to the 4 skills, because each of these modes has an oral and a written component. So oral and written reception, oral and written production is, of course, the 4 skills. But interaction, oral, and now with the new technologies also written, is not the same as production. So it's a different mode of communication, and mediation is yet another mode of communication that was not developed at the beginning in the CFR. And of course, each of them requires a strategic action, which the CFR highlights by providing descriptors for strategies. So we can say that before the CFR, we had a landscape, we had a situation like that. We had the 4 skills. We had the idea that the learner is either a speaker or a hearer, or the language user. We were focusing on accuracy versus fluency in the code, or a balance between accuracy and fluency, I should say, and the idea that you mobilize the language you have learned. With the CFR, things change. As I said, you add interaction and mediation, and you add the idea that in interaction, the learner is a participant, that we are at a social use of language. And in mediation, there is the announcement, but not yet the development, of a very important concept, the concept of social agent. And also, if you notice here, you don't just mobilize what you have learned officially, I would say what you've learned institutionally in your classes, but you mobilize your linguistic resources. Now, with the CFR 2.0, like the new venue where we are with with the CFR Companion Volume 2018, which is an update of the CFR 2001, update and extension, we have a new vision which has been developed. The learner is a user learner seen as a social agent, and we as teacher and they as learner do not only have to have a balance between accuracy and fluency, but the complexity of the language is also important. And as mediator, as a social agent who's engaged in mediator, they also co-construct a meaning by mobilizing general and plurilingual, pluricultural competencies. So let's see what this mediation is and the new CFR and why it is so important. So just as a transition, the innovative aspects of the CFR 2001, as I said, were curriculum alignment, the 4 modes of communication, the idea of constructing meaning in interaction, defining the learner as a social agent, starting to propose a task-based, action-oriented approach, and giving a definition of plurilingual and pluricultural competence. Sorry. Now, with the new companion volume, what do we have? Apart from having an update of the CFR, completing the CFR with new scales and examples of domain, broadening their concept, particular mediation, but we also have refining the pedagogical vision and developing the construct. So we will now focus on these three aspects: mediation, the action-oriented approach, and the idea of pluri. Sorry. Okay, let's go back a moment to the descriptive scheme. See, mediation was the fourth mode of communication with mediation strategies. And let's see now a bit more in depth what it is and why it is so important for language education. When we developed the descriptors for mediation and the broader conceptualization, as usual, you start from what you have. Well, what we had in the CFR 2001 was not very much, actually. There was this idea of being a mediator, so you're not concerned with expressing your own meaning, but you act as an intermediary between interlocutors who are unable to understand each other, mostly, but not exclusively, and that was already a good sign, because they don't speak the same language. And then there were examples of interpreters and translators that by profession do that, but also they said, hey, it's not just for interpreters and translators. In the real life, in everyday life, we do all the time some mediation. We mediate language by processing and reprocessing an existing text, and this occupies a big space in our societies. So there were already grains that were able to germinate that helped us move further. And in a previous version of the CFR, which was in a beta version online at the end of the 90s, there was this scheme that showed that interaction has a links reception and production, but mediation has a kind of link to all three. And this was also important for us to situate mediation. So we can say that through mediation, language serves different purposes. It creates this plurilingual, pluricultural space for communication and learning, reduces affective blocks and tensions. We know this meaning of mediation, building bridges toward the new, the other, constructing and co-constructing new meaning, and of course, passing on information, sometimes by acting on this information, and acting as an intermediary between people who don't understand each other, the one that we saw before. So this idea that in the real life we are always trying to decode something, make like in a map, we draw on all possible resources and tools that we have to make meaning, both in a language and through different languages, in order to access knowledge, access concept, messages, cultures. But we are not alone when we do this, because learners always have other people. They can do things socially together. We also interact with others. So we are always in this double perspective between individual and social construction and co-construction of meaning. This is very important. Continue going from individual and social. What is this model that I'm presenting here? Well, this is the model that we we came up with during the process of development of descriptors for mediation in the new CFR. As you can imagine, we read extensively because mediation has been studied by philosophy, psychology, education, law, and you name it. But we needed to distill, to come to what is important for language education. So This idea, as I said, of the individual and the social, so the cognitive and the relational, being embedded one in each other, is the core aspect of mediation. But it's not the only one, because we do not just mediate within a language, but we mediate across languages and cultures. So with a more plurilingual view, we mediate across media when we communicate and use media like what we are doing now. And we mediate also across words when we, for example, read or use literature. We have to deal with centuries before, for example, or other geographical and cultural contexts. So we have to mediate. And cognitive relational, as we know, are always in a framework of emotional. As human beings, we can't dissociate the three. So this was our conceptual model to develop the descriptors. But as you can imagine, this was rather complicated. So we had to go down to some categories that would make sense in the class. And this meant operationalizing the new vision into calibrated and validated descriptors for mediating communication, mediating concepts, and mediating a text. And of course, as I said, the strategies, as I mentioned before. So when you open the new companion volume, you have maps like that help you navigate through all these new scales of descriptors. And here it's how you would see mediating a text, mediating concept, mediating communication, and then all the strategies. All these are titles of scales that include descriptors going from a level A1 all the way to a level C2. And you mediate across languages, but also across language varieties and registers, or within one language variety and register. Let's see them a bit better. What kind of scales you have? You have something that I'm sure as teacher we are already very familiar with, like mediating a text, relaying specific information, explaining data, processing a text, translating a written text, etc. But you also have mediating communication. So you act as an intermediary, or you facilitate a pluricultural and plurilingual space, and communication, you facilitate communication in delicate situations. And then something a bit deeper that we're not so familiar with is collaborating to construct a meaning, or managing interaction, encouraging conceptual talk. Not that these things are not done in the class, they are done, but they didn't have a name before. So this idea of mediation is to make the invisible visible. And then, of course, the mediation strategies. You link to your previous knowledge, you break down complicated information, adapt your language, elaborate or streamline a text. Let's see some examples of descriptors. For example, at the level B1, which is a low intermediate, we have can ask people to elaborate on specific points they made in their initial explanation. Or, mediating a text can summarize in language B a short narrative or article, a talk, discussion, etc., in language A, and answer further questions about the tale. This language A and B can be the same language, or can be two different languages. That's why it was not specified. Or you mediate communication. See, for example, ask parties in disagreement to explain their point of view and respond briefly to their explanation. As I said, other scales are more specific for plurilingual competence, online interaction, and literature. I didn't put descriptors here, but just let me say one thing. Literature was really a demand of teachers. They said, we do use literature and we don't want just to do analysis and criticism of creative text, but we also read for pleasure. So we added the scales for expressing a personal response to creative texts that include literature and reading as a leisure activity to open up all that part. And then, as you can imagine, online interaction has become much more important. That was also an update of the CFR, and the idea of building plurilingual and pluricultural repertoires. Let's see, why do we use plurilingual and not multilingual? When you go around Toronto, you see very often something like that. See, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 languages, and we have this idea of pharmacy, oh, more than that. Yeah, we have this idea of having everything next to each other to understand. But we know that next to each other doesn't necessarily mean peace and interest in the other. It can be separation. So multiple languages per se, they don't mean plurilingualism. They mean a series of multiple languages and probably cultures that don't know about each other, and they live next to each one, and this is the Berlin Wall, and we know where it brings not to have any connection. But things are moving, because in Zurich last summer, look at this nice panel, like invitation. This Baba takeaway is said, nicht nur takeaway, auch zum Mitnehmen und to go. So I don't know if you understand German, but takeaway is more the British, no? And he mixes German, not only takeaway, but also to take away in German, and to go, which is the North American version of takeaway. So it's very interesting that he doesn't cut the things, but there is a flow, and it goes from one language and one variation of the language. So basically here he has at least 3 languages and 4 cultures, because Baba was a kind of Middle Eastern street food stand. So plurilingualism is different from multilingualism, because you don't just put languages side by side, but you mediate, you consider them as a whole, and something that has no fixed borders, and you can go from one to the other and mix them. So the CFR pioneered the idea of this linguistic and cultural diversity as a resource, and valued these profiles that we have in different languages, because plurilingualism is an uneven and changing competence, and we have different resources and in the different languages, and I'm sure you see yourself in this kind of portrait. But we do have a single interrelated repertoire that we combine with all our knowledge and competencies and strategies when we are supposed to asked to accomplish tasks. So the companion volume broadens this idea of profile within and across languages, and talks about a gain of space in relevant terrain, and there are even graphical representations of that. So we go from a linear version to a complex version with these 3 aspects that I have already presented: plurilingualism, mediation, and we will see more on action orientation. So we can definitely say that mediation is a new prism to make sense of this new vision, because each can do, but this always, and not just on mediation, as we said, can be used as a curriculum target, as a criterion for selecting and developing learning activities, and as a starting point for the elaboration of assessment criteria. Let's see now some practical implications of that and some examples. So, some examples of mediation and plurilingualism showing that things start to move. For example, we have high stake exams and even specification from ministries of education that use some aspects of mediation, like in Greece, the KPG exam, processing a text in writing, specification in German, relaying specific information in speech, processing a text in writing, acting as an intermediary, and the Austrian Berufsmatura, which is the end of secondary school certificate, gives a certificate of plurilingualism where you use scales for explaining data, processing text in a speech, and acting as an intermediary. Let's see what does it mean. So the idea of going from a monolingual test to a multilingual test. And see, the idea here is the task that you have on your right. Imagine that you work for the Greek tourist organization. Your department has received a request from the tourist organization of another country for information about the very successful Blue Flag program. You have been asked to write a report explaining how Greece has managed to achieve the Blue Flag status. Use the information from the website below to write your report. So the idea is that they receive material in Greek and they have to be able to use these as sources for mediating a certain content into the target language, in this case English. And this is done in a high-stake test. Let's see the Berufsmatura. So here we have levels that they expect to be students to be at B2 levels in the L2, English or German for an immigrant, and B1 competence in the L3, which can be French, Italian, Spanish, or Russian. They want to test their ability to switch between languages, their pluricultural competence, and their communication strategies. So they have different phases in this exam where you have a phase 1 mediating a text, you present information in L1 that you receive in L1 to speakers of other languages, your L2 English or your L3 Spanish, for example. And you can alternate between L2 and L3 when you explain each point. So it's not two different exams. And then in the phase 2, you mediate communication in collaborative discussions. So you collaborate with L2 and L3 speakers to design a joint project. And in doing that, you act as an intermediate. You act sometimes as an interpreter or you provide information when needed. In textbooks, also things start to change. This is a textbook of English foreign language in a German book. In the German context, sorry. And we have this situation. The Walters are shopping at the big supermarket during the holidays in California. They are listening to the announcement, but Mr. Walter can't understand them. Listen to the announcement, take notes on what's important, prices, till when is the offer, what's special, and explain to Mr. Walter in German the important points in each. See, here we are learning English. So we are really testing the listening comprehension and the mediation from English into German, which is the language of schooling for the students. Because one of the problems is mixing the different communicative activities in the test, and saying, okay, explain me what you have understood, but the moment you have to explain, you are producing in the foreign language. So what are you testing there? Are you testing the understanding or the production? So see, this is a way of doing that. So, and let's see, these were tests, exams, etc. Let's see possibilities or ideas and things that have already been done to mediate, to use mediation in everyday class. This is an example of England upper secondary school, and they are visibly start learning French. So the background studying is education in France and education in England, and the cultural aspect is very important. How do you see the structure of authority in the two kinds of school? And we have a spoken mediation task. You're hosting a French or female exchange student. Your mother has received a letter from the head teacher saying that because last year some French students wore inappropriate clothes, he wants them this year to wear the school uniform. You have to explain this to your French guest in French. Your guest refuses, your mother insists, your task is to be the interpreter. If you have knowledge of French, you can imagine how the refusal of uniforms for school would be very real. So you have a situation where you really have to act as an intermediary, as a mediator. You can do in the classes mediating a text and mediating concepts in a very kind of intuitive way. So, for example, using documents that we easily find on the net, like little video talk shows, longer or shorter, depending on also the level of the class, the time you have. On a hot topic like climate change, for example, you would have phase 1, reception, mediating a text, note taking, where the two students have two different videos to watch. And then you would have a phase 2 of dialogue, in which they mediate a text and process a text. So you explain to your part the facts and viewpoints expressed in your video. And then you explain, you listen, you interrupt to ask for clarification, check comprehension, and then you join another pair to form a group of 4, discuss the 2 videos and formulate actions. What do you think must be done locally and how people like you could help persuade your institution to adopt this policy? So see, we have basically all the communicative activities here: listening, understanding, so mediating an oral text, then comprehension, then we have an interaction into 2, then we have we expand and we have a mediation, and we have a production, which we don't know, but it could be done in a written form or in an oral form. To do that, you would have specific descriptors. You have specific descriptors from the companion volume. See, you know that at the level B1, this is the way they would you would expect them to be able to take notes, or processing text in speech, or facilitating collaborator and constructing meaning. So you're guided, you're helped. When you envisage, when you plan such a task, you go first to these descriptors, you have an idea of the level of what to expect, and you plan. Let's see another example, also real. Mediating a text and mediating communication at the restaurant is something that we always have in textbooks. A2 level, so lower than the one before. You have this, but inserting a realistic mediation activity changes everything. And we will see how. See, when a person does not speak the language or is not familiar with the target culture, they need help. This is what we have had with friends visiting us from abroad. So these are the kind of menus that you can find in every textbooks and online. More difficult or easier, as you can see, in one language or in more languages. Again, you choose the relevant descriptors from the CFR, and you can have here, see, a range going from A2 to B1, because you may want to try some more difficult strategies and see if they work, even if they are at the A2 level, because they are strategies. So it's accessible. And then you start your activity where you have a dialogue first. There is a student A, and that has prepared himself in advance, and a student B that doesn't understand the menu. So you have to explain to this friend who doesn't understand what it is. And as you know, it's not just translating, but it's saying about the dish, what it contains culturally, etc., etc. So when he understands, the student B, it chooses what you want, but it's student A who's going to pass the order. And again, you have relevant descriptors from the CFR for acting as an intermediary, adapting your language, adapting a text, amplifying, because in this case you amplify a text. See, you don't simplify a menu, you amplify that, and you link to previous knowledge. Then comes the trialogue. You would insert another student, the waiter. Probably at the beginning you may want to have a stronger student to play the student C role. And you have this mediation and interaction between the three students that need to pass the information, but also have a lot of doubts. And student C has some of the replies. You can do that more plurilingual. You can add descriptors from plurilingual comprehension and plurilingualism. So see, you can have menus in different languages, and you can use parallel translation of text to develop understanding of these languages and of the content. And then a project I've been coordinating, and I'm still ongoing. So if then somebody is interested, I'm very happy to have other participants. We developed an entire set of scenarios, action-oriented scenarios. This was done for teaching German in an upper secondary school. Storytelling is important in the German tradition. So the idea was to work on storytelling for the 21st century. And this is the scenario. So in order to encourage, in order to encourage younger community members to actively appreciate the stories, your local library is asking the community to donate some of their favorite childhood fairy tale. You take a look through your collection and decide that many of your favorites needed to be updated because they're not written in English and do not include any modern morals that would interest the younger generation. To complete the task, you will need to write an original English fairy tale with modern twists for a 21st century child. So you see, we have a scenario with a final task, which is in this case a written one. But to get to that final task, you have to do this backward design and see, okay, how do I bring my students to go there? In our project, we also drew from the indigenous epistemologies to try and help the reflection of the holistic reflection of learning. But this is an extra point. But for the action-oriented approach, you would have the idea that by the end of the scenario, your main goals are that the students identify stereotypes and in various cultures and languages and discuss them and discuss how this might be damaging to your minds today. And then they identify the common features of fairy tale from the German-speaking region, but also from other cultures. So you see, they kind of prepare themselves to have to reach these goals through becoming aware of different points. And then you, as a teacher, you start to plan saying, okay, what communicative activities will they use and develop through this scenario? Well, these are the can-do statements that you can use. Can understand the main point, can write straightforward connected fairy tales, can give a presentation. This is the what you want your student to do at the end and during the task. And then comes the how. How well do you want them to be able to perform? Because you can perform things at different levels and you can't cover everything. In each scenarios, you will focus more on certain aspects than others. The how is not just linguistic, as we saw in the previous slides or in this slide, but this second slide shows that. Do you remember the descriptive scheme? We also have a pragmatic and sociolinguistic competence. We have sociocultural competence And we have or can have a plurilingual, pluricultural dimension. So linguistic is clear, has always been taught. Accuracy, fluency, pronunciation, okay. But pragmatic and sociolinguistic registers, etc., is not always as present as it should be. And the sociocultural, even less possibly. So these aspects are very visible through the CFR descriptors and can help the teacher plan. Then you would chunk down because the main task was a big one. So you need some hours to get there. You can't do that in one lesson. The idea is to plan over a period of time so that students can really do a culminating task. And so you have to say, okay, subtask, first hour, we will do that. Second hour, subtask 2, we will do that. And see, it's a kind of mini task that all together not only develop those linguistic, sociolinguistic, and pragmatic competencies, but also are building bricks for them to be able to accomplish the final task. So, embedding mediation in everyday class is definitely not mission impossible. It's something that can, on the contrary, help reconsider the way we teach languages. And so, if we had to say, what is this mediation according to the CFR? It's the idea to use one or more languages to complete an integrated task. Each task has integrated different modes of communication, reception, interaction, production, for example, to make sense, to collaborate, to create artifacts. This is an important point of the action-oriented approach. You create something at the end, which can be written, oral, can be graphical, can be even an object for the maybe even younger learner. But to get there, you use the language, you use collaboration, etc. And you use local, relevant, authentic materials creatively. You move away from the idea that there is a word-for-word translation, so that everything needs always to be clear, because it's the strategic and mediated nature of understanding and talking that is important. You become aware of the importance of strategies in this process, and you start as a teacher thinking in terms of level. What can I reasonably expect from a B2 that cannot be expected from a B1? So if I am a B1, I can't ask them to do something which is typical of the B2. We had a piloting phase of those descriptors, and you see, even from a couple of quotes, the teacher said so that the students were more aware of how language can be used to collaborate, take turns, build a conversation, work toward a goal, and they helped draw attention on the end results and the objectives. And also what they noticed is that there was a much more collaborative way of acting, building on each other's ideas and presenting one's own ideas to invoke discussion. So language serves really different mediation purposes: creating plurilingual and pluricultural space, reducing the affective block, building bridges, co-constructing new meaning, passing on information, and acting as an intermediary, which is the list I had passed to you before. And the action-oriented approach is the new approach, or the kind of development of the approach that allows this to happen. You have real-life tasks, strategic decision-making process, transparency of objectives, and it's different from what we had in the communicative approach, because we see that the main aim is now social, and the task is complex and not just linguistic, but there is a know how to do transfer. You transfer and mobilize your competencies, and you accomplish a mission. So to try and see things, it's not throwing everything you knew or we knew away. and embracing a new approach. No, it was a stepping stone. This green thing, it's a kind of visualizing stepping stones, because the communicative had opened door to a lot of aspects that the action-oriented has brought further. So you learn about already said, learn the language, not about the language. Use authentic material, focus on the functions and real-life situations, working group. But now we are towards this idea of work in tasks, where you use both linguistic and general competencies. Assessment as a positive role is accompanying, and you have these communicative activities in these four modes. Strategies are important in order also to become responsible and autonomous. And the plurilingual and intercultural aspect is not a side one, but it's relevant and it's there. So basically, if we had the suggestion to the class, and this was a publication I had for FSL, but it can be used for any languages, the idea that the learner is a social agent, that the process is strategic, reflective, and transferable, that tasks are a unifying tool, and culture is everywhere, and competencies are numerous and different, and assessment is multidimensional and present from the beginning. And I have some bullet point, just a kind of suggestions for the teachers. So what we hope that it will happen is that mediation will will repeat the success of interaction. Interaction changed the things. Before we only had production, and now we differentiate between production and interaction. So if mediation is successful, it will show that there is an extra layer there. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I let you with this nice quote from John Trim, who was the coordinator of the first project. And okay, sorry. And there you go. And the computer is protesting. But I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice... And I'm there for the questions online. Sorry, I forgot to say that.